What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Outcast Podcast. I'm your host, Leo, and my pronouns are he, him.
My name is Rose, and my pronouns are she, her.
My name's Hunter, and my pronouns are she, her.
For this episode, we will be speaking with local author, educator, and host of the NPR podcast, The Facing Project, J.R. Jamison, and his book, Hillbilly Queer, a memoir. In his memoir, J.R. explores his complicated relationship with his father and strives to understand his political ideals in hopes of building a bridge between them. Set in 2016, before the election, J.R. recalls the stark political tension that ravished America during that time and how it divided many families. Determined to mend the relationship with his father, J.R. agrees to go on a trip with him for his 55th year class reunion in Missouri. During their travels, J.R. contemplates the many aspects of his own identity and what it means to be a queer person with hillbilly roots. The trip with his father transformed into a journey of self-discovery as J.R. starts to question his own ideas of privilege, queerness, whiteness, politics, and family. So without further ado, we would like to welcome J.R. to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I love what you all are doing, and it's an honor to be a guest on your show.
Thank you, and it's an honor to have you. So if there's not anything else you would like to say, do you want to get right into the questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first question we wanted to ask, can you explain how you came up with the title Hillbilly Queer and how this inspired you to write this memoir?
Yeah, Hillbilly Queer was a journey of self-discovery and going back to the roots of who I am as an individual and who I am in the present. And it's funny because as I was drafting the book and I was playing around with title ideas, my brother said, "You're not a hillbilly. Why would you use that in the title?" But the reality is, and you all would know this reading the book, that my family is from rural South Central Missouri, not far from the Arkansas border. And that is, for a lack of a better word, what some folks consider hill country or hillbilly country deep in the Ozark Mountains. So for me, as I was looking at my past and who makes me what I am and who I am in the present, Hillbilly Queer really stuck out, as a title that just made sense. And in some ways it's abrupt, right? So you want a title to jump off the shelf. And Hillbilly Queer it's two words that on the surface seem like they don't go together, that they're opposing. But at the same time, they're so beautifully fit together. So as I was brainstorming ideas of the book, Hillbilly Queer just made sense to me. And I rolled with it. And, I have a lot of mixed reactions to that title from folks, but I'm glad that we went with that. As far as the inspiration behind the book, obviously 2016 was the inspiration behind that and the presidential election. And I was starting to see at that time people I know posting certain things on Facebook that just really puzzled me. And I started to question, have these people always thought this way? Or is this something new? And then I was seeing this happen with my own family as well. Also at that time, I had a close friend from college who I had studied abroad with in China. And we had lost touch for several years after graduating, but Facebook brought us back together. So that can be kind of the beauty of social media, right? We find these people we haven't seen in so long. But the horror of it is I saw a side of him that I never had known before. And it didn't come out right away. But after several weeks of being his friend on social media, I started to question our relationship. And I actually want to do a small reading of a piece that actually then led to the inspiration of Hillbilly Queer. And it's called Disappearing Acts. And I'll begin now. Act 1. Dear friend, it's been so long. Where have you been? Your kids are cute. I see that they speak Chinese. Remember our time in China? Long nights on the Yangtze, warm breezes blowing our hair and our emotions, young college guys looking for an adventure in a far-off, exotic land, a place where we would stand out, foreigners. We jumped from boats, we ran up banks, and landed in our beds at night with windows open. Ni chi fan la mei crept up the walls and into the room, reverberations from the street below, the warm, sticky smell of vendors' carts. We stirred in the heat, pillows over our head, relinquishing sleep. We snuck down and outside and succumbed to the calling. Goat on a stick, long walks under amber lights, talking about our lives back home, our wishes for the future. China nights were so present it felt like tomorrow would never come. Or maybe I didn't want tomorrow to come. But years pass, and in a flash, here we are, 20 years later, reconnected on Facebook. Dear friend, I miss you. How are you? Act 2, dear friend. I've gone through your page, and there's some interesting posts about your present. The liberal media send them back, cries that scream, but whites were slaves too. Where have you been, my friend? Did you always feel this way, especially during our late night talks? A piece of you that never revealed itself? No? Then what happened over time that changed you and your thoughts? Was it always there, dear friend? Was I too someone who held views like you? Where did our paths take us over the last 20 years that diverged in either direction, twisting and turning and taking you from me and perhaps me from you? Dear friend, who are you? Act 3, dear friend, I got your message. The one where you told me I'd become part of the problem, part of the taking down of what was America. You said that my stats about death and destruction were wrong. You said that a Muslim would kill me outright, hang me from the town wall. So why do I stand up for those people's freedom? You said that I'm not a true American. But dear friend, who are these real Americans that you speak of? Act 4, old friend. We cannot see eye to eye. I can never find middle ground with a person like you. Can you change? Will you change? Me? I've done nothing wrong. And if I do any changing over time, it will be for the better. The America I stand for is one that sees everyone as equal, one that understands our past wrongs and finds ways to right those, a place where everyone can love who they want. Freedom. That is the definition of what America was supposed to become, and one that I believe can still happen. Oh, I see. My definition of freedom takes away from yours? How so, old friend? Act 5, to the person I once knew. I miss you. I miss the laughter of those nights in China, you telling me old stories about your childhood, the person I thought you were. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Have I disappeared too? Before we march off to war toward each other, know that I once loved you. And I wrote that piece because I'm a writer and I process my emotions through word. And trying to grapple at that time with changes I was seeing in society and figuring out, is it social media? Is it what's going on here? I started to look at, do I cut everyone out of my life who I feel like has wronged me in some way, or they've said something that has offended me? How do we move forward around this? And at the same time, as I was, wrestling with this in my mind, my dad reached out and asked me to take this road trip with him. And as I stepped back and looked at my friend who I wrote this piece about, and I looked at my father, while they may have been on the same political spectrum, they were miles apart from being the same person. And so I did the most radical thing I could do in that moment. And I said, yeah, I'll go on this trip with you. And there we were, two people on either ends of the political spectrum, a history that spanned my entire lifetime, father and son, liberal and conservative, traveling across the heartland to find our ways back to one another. And that was the only thing I could do in that moment to make sense of the world.
I think that excerpt was, I think, very powerful, first of all. It was an excellent writing piece. But I also was going to say that I do think that that's kind of the biggest and most relevant question that a lot of us are dealing with, is just, we're noticing so much more now. These people we thought we knew are just have a much different the people we thought we knew have different political takes than we originally thought they did. And so we kind of wanted to ask one of your opinions on that.
About connecting with folks who have a different political.
Well, sorry, I was trying to lead into Hunter's question.
Mm-hmm.
So my question was more so like, do you think things have gotten worse in terms of racism, xenophobia, transphobia, or if it's just brought out to the light and like made to be like and made social acceptance like?
I think both, honestly. I think that it's been brought to light, but I also do think it has gotten worse. And one of the reasons for this is based in our genetic makeup as people. So we all have things called mirror neurons, and mirror neurons can be positive or they can be negative. And what a mirror neuron essentially is how we respond to each other. And it starts at birth. When you hear babies crying in a nursery, are they hungry? Yeah, probably. But usually one baby starts and all of them start. And the reason why other babies cry when they hear another baby cry is empathy. It's built in our DNA. And so that's why when you see somebody yawn, what happens? You usually see somebody else yawn, or if somebody stretches because they're in a presentation and they're like, oh, this is so boring, I need to stretch. Somebody else at the table or in the room will typically stretch. And those are mirror neurons triggering. And it's the basis of empathy. But on the flip side of that, it can also lead to groupthink in a negative way. So if you see somebody who you admire and they're saying hateful things, they have hate speech, that can trigger somebody else to do the same or to follow misinformation, right? If we look at what's happening now across our country, there's so much misinformation that's put out all the time and shared on social media. And that all connects back to mirror neurons and our connections that we have with one another. And so I would say it's actually both. I think that it's been brought to light because xenophobia, racism, homophobia, hate against the LGBTQIA plus community has existed forever. It's existed for a long, long time. So it's not like this new thing. I think people had buried it for a while because of social norms, but our social norms have flipped in a way where it's become acceptable almost. And so we're at this weird spot, right?
I feel like there's been like a cultural shift, I guess, in politics because, we used to have like Clinton liberalism. And then after Clinton liberalism, we had like Bush conservatism. And then after that, we had like Obama liberalism, and Obama liberalism was like a regurgitation of Clinton liberalism. So it was very like post-racial and like, he lifted the marriage ban. And so like it felt like this is going to be a weird reference for me to make right now, but you know how like Sex and the City says that like the 90s is like the end of history. It kind of felt like the Obama liberalism was sort of like the end of the political warfare that was happening in that time. And we felt like, oh, this is like very like kumbaya, like whatever. And then we started to get more into the internet. And then with the internet, we started to realize that a lot of these views that we thought were just comedic and like no one else had were actually a lot more popular than we thought. Because, people would have like the Ku Klux Klan on like Jerry Springer, and like that was like a funny thing. But then we like got to the internet and we realized that like, wait a second, actually, these views are not as niche and unpopular as we think. And they're getting people to the like certain people into the White House, which is very scary. So it's like, before, like with the alt-right, it's like they used to be the ones that the moderate conservatives would sort of use for votes, but like we're on the fringes. And like now the moderate conservatives sort of feel like they're on the fringes, and the alt-right are the people that they have to go to kind of like have political power. It's like sort of shifted. So like now all the stuff that was on the fringes is like to the forefront now because of the internet and the way in which these groups have been able to organize through different platforms.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, too, in our country, if you look at history and political parties, the pendulum always swings one way or the other really hard and very quickly. And I think we, at least for me, speaking from my own perspective, during the Obama years, I had so much hope about where we were headed as a country. As you referenced, the Supreme Court struck down the marriage ban in 2015. We're only 7 years out from that, and in some ways it feels like decades ago, right? As we've lived through the 7 years since marriage equality, the pendulum has swung so far in our country the other way. And right now, where we're sitting, I feel like the pendulum is kind of at this place where it's trying to determine which way it's going to swing. And I have a lot of concern about, and I know I'm not alone here, but I have a lot of concern about where the pendulum is going next. I'm not certain. I'm looking ahead and I don't know if it's going to make a hard swing left or right. It feels very uncertain right now as we move into the next few years.
Also, sort of playing back to the original question about the state of xenophobia, racism, transphobia, and how socially acceptable they are as of right now, and the mirror neurons, issues have definitely gotten exacerbated through social media, not just because you have people starting to be more open about certain views that might not have been very acceptable to share in person, but you also have people being more visible in general. So like the LGBT community, I just like, maybe not necessarily that, but it feels like as we've progressed in regards to racial justice and laws in support of the LGBT community, those are becoming more common. And when those become more common and we have the internet as a sort of tool to help put support out there for these groups, you'll have the people who don't support that, who also have the same tool to use to push back, which can, make things really crazy. And the added thing of misinformation being so rampant online can also make things worse. And then, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling. I'm going to continue. It's not just about mirror neurons, though that is something definitely important and to bring up, but it's also just humans, we're social. And a lot of times, depending on your community, and especially depending on your family, I mean, not only can ideology spread through your family, but trauma can also affect how you see the world and how you view systems of oppression. And that's also generational. So there's just so many different social, I want to say pieces, but I don't really think social factors, I would say, that definitely contribute to how people see politics, how they integrate different political views into their own political ideology.
I definitely feel like I've noticed, especially with more of the visibility of trans people in media too, it's like transphobia has always been there, but like it sort of looks different now because trans people are sort of being integrated into society. So like it feels as though because there are more trans people to yell at now, and they're not and we're not being pushed to the side, we see a lot more of it. So it kind of almost feels like there is more of it, even though maybe there's not. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like the visibility kind of almost adds to it in a way because, like you said, like we are social beings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think reactionary politics tend to increase kind of with progressive politics. Like we've mentioned the pendulum theory, and just I think that it's also on a cultural level. I think the increase in visibility causes an increase of fear of displacement. Culture and politics have shifted so far, so fast, that I think, especially for a lot of more conservative people or just older people, the social change is super hard to grasp and keep up with. And that's not to say they should make an effort, but still I can empathize with the idea of just kind of everything around you is changing. And when you don't understand it, it can be scary and make you mad. And sometimes I think that's where a lot of the reactionary politics come from. Mm-hmm. Not just old bigotry, but just, again, this fear of being replaced and your place of power in this world being taken away from you when it should have never been yours in the first place. But that's still the fear. When you have been afforded a privilege your whole life that you never even knew about, when you start to lose some of that privilege, it feels like you're losing something you were entitled to.
I think you're right. And I think there's also a fear of misstepping. And you have to, when you're connecting with somebody across difference, or loving, which is a word I'm trying to use more now, is loving across difference, because connecting across difference or trying to create understanding across difference in some ways is like the word tolerance. So when I was growing up, tolerance was this word that people were embracing, and they're like, yes, that's it. We're going to tolerate the LGBTQ community. And it was on posters. It was in classroom. It was just like this. It's like, tolerate, like you're going to tolerate who I am. And we've moved more toward acceptance. And I think loving falls more in that case. But when we're looking across these divides and also generational divides, I see that there are people who are afraid of losing power. And in those cases, those aren't necessarily the people I want to spend my time or energy on trying to convince a different way. But I try to focus more on the people who I know are coming from a good place. And because I'm staying in their life and because I'm still loving them across that difference, perhaps I can change their perspective some. And what I find with some of those folks, and my father in particular, for him, it's not a fear of losing power. It's a fear of misstepping. And it's being terrified of, if I say the wrong thing, people are going to come after me. And so with somebody like my father, I have safe spaces with him where if there's a question about trans people, or there's a question about anything that's through the LGBTQIA plus community, it's a space where he can ask me specific questions where he knows I'm not going to come at him. Whereas if it's somebody who doesn't know him and he may say something that's out of step in public, our natural reaction is to go after folks who we don't have that connection to. So I think some of it is misstepping too, and people being afraid of saying the wrong thing. And that's not the truth for everyone. I do think there are lots of people out there who are afraid of losing that power. And that is why they are trying to fight back, or they're big mad about these things that just don't make sense, right? Because on one hand, they're talking about freedom, but then on the other hand, they're really holding people back from being their true, authentic selves. And that was a bit all over the place. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. I definitely see, I feel like my mom is sort of similar in the way of viewing it as like loving someone despite their differences, but not necessarily having that love mean like I interact with you regularly, or, well, that's not really the term I would want to say, but like, my mom is pretty religious, but like not in a bad way, which I don't know. That kind of statement feels weird in and of itself just because I'm so used to religion not being in my life in a good way. But anyway, that's off topic. Where it's like she very much she's not going to tolerate someone or like disregard that someone deserves to be held accountable or have consequences for negative actions. But she very much wants to try and be open and allow people room to grow and learn. And I definitely think for some people that is a good thing. That is a good way to go about it when it comes to differences, because most people want to do good by other individuals. Most people want to grow and learn more about the world. And I know that in my mom's case, there are sometimes in the past where we've disagreed on certain political topics, and she's not on the right side of politics by any means. I'd say she's probably more like central, leaning slightly to the left. I used to think she was more progressive, but that was just compared to my other relatives who, as I got older, learned weren't as not conservative as I thought. But there's a lot of different subjects where she's been able to learn and grow from her interactions with me, because I'm very hyper conscious of these kinds of things and try to be constantly learning about them. So it is easy to be on the defensive, because so often you have people who on purpose will try to, perpetuate really negative, problematic, hurtful ideology. But there are people who are willing to learn. And sometimes it's easy to forget that. And it is important to remember that. But also to be able to know when that isn't the case, and when the best option is to just not give them your time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the trick is knowing the difference between those two people. And I think my father and my friend, who I wrote the short story about that I read at the beginning of our conversation, that those are two perfect examples. So looking at the type of speech my friend was putting out there, he seemed almost too far gone, right? And I still have him on my friends list on social media. I think about deleting him all the time. But I don't, because I'm hoping maybe he'll see some of my posts that will get through. But the reality is that probably isn't the truth. And maybe I should just delete him. But when I step back and look at him versus my father, I could actually work with my father. And I have, right, through the trip, the writing of the book, our connection that we still stay together to this point. I just, his birthday was last weekend, and I went and saw him and spent 5 hours with him. And we just talked about lots of nothing, right? We were just hanging out and connecting. And that feels really great to connect in that way. And it was only possible because we had that connection. And I saw that he was somebody who I could get through to. But at the same time, I had to be open to admitting that I'm maybe not always right all the time. And from his perspective were ideas that he had that I needed to listen to, even though I maybe didn't agree, but were starting points for conversations between the two of us that wouldn't set us both off into any kind of argument. And so when I look at my old friend and I look at my dad is the place where I could really love across that difference and have civil conversations to try to find somewhat of common ground, although we won't always agree on everything.
So then, sort of continuing on from this, with one of your biggest themes of your book being the idea of doing what you were talking about and like bridging ideological gaps between your loved ones, there's a lot of people in the LGBT community who are growing up and or living in conservative areas and are struggling with whether or not they feel they can afford to try and bridge gaps with their loved ones, or whether they need to cut off communication with relatives that go against their morals and values and such. So maybe, I know you sort of talked about it a little bit using your own experiences as an example, but would you have like any ideas on, let's just say for the people who know that they might have a chance, even if it's just trying to bridge that gap and seeing whether or not that their idea was right. If you want to try to keep lines of communication open with relatives you're struggling with, what do you think would be like a safe, or I don't know if I want to say easy, but like how do you think, what kind of way would be best to go about doing that?
Having conversations and reaching out. And I often hear in our community, in the LGBTQI community, I'm really tired of having to be the one who's always reaching out. And I do agree with that. I do think that's so true. We shouldn't have to be the ones always reaching out. But in the case with family, sometimes we do have to be that person that reaches out, unfortunately. But we have to remember that these conversations and loving across difference, it's a two-way street. And so as you're entering these conversations, you'll begin to find really quickly if you're traveling down the right path or you're about ready to enter a do not enter sign, right? And in that case, you have to trust your instincts, and it's going to be different for every person. So my experience that I had with my dad is not going to be the same experience that you might have with your mom, or, somebody might have with their aunt, Karen, who posts really, insane things on social media. It just may not be the same for everyone. So I can only speak from my experience, but in that experience, I found that you can find pretty much right away whether or not it is a path that you're going to be able to go down, or if it's one that you need to stop. And safety is first and foremost. And that's critical. And the safety of your headspace is something that you need to keep close. And if it is a relationship that you feel like is not going to go anywhere, it's actually going to create more trauma for you or bring up some of these past hurts that you're not at a place that you want to go down that path, it's totally acceptable to own that and to say, I'm not going to explore these conversations with this specific person, but I do know that, you know, my friend so-and-so who we have disagreements on X, Y, and Z, there may be somebody who I can explore that. So it's not going to work with every relationship, but it will work with some relationships. And the trick is determining which relationship is the right one to focus your energy on.
I think that makes a lot of sense, that you just kind of have to go with your gut about, first of all, how much do you value this relationship? And there's no shame in saying, like, if someone has made it clear that they hate you and your life, like the choices you have made in life and who you are as a person makes you a bad person in their eyes, then you are under no obligation to take their abuse for the sake of trying to keep a relationship going. But there's also to be something to be said for trying to just make sure they know you're available if they want to try and make things better, or if they want to talk, if you're willing to, or able to do that for your own mental health. I think you're right that it is a entirely case-by-case basis. And I think what's hard for me is identity is not negotiable. So who we are as LGBTQIA plus individuals, that's who we are. That's who we were born to be. And that's not negotiable. Political party is negotiable. So I don't want to confuse the two at all. And I do get asked that question by folks too. Well, how do you connect with somebody who absolutely hates the LGBTQ community? And that's not a place where I am going to spend my space, you know, or my time. I'm going to focus on somebody like my dad, who has always accepted me, surprisingly, as a gay man. But there are lots of other areas that we don't agree on. And also, you know, his love for Trump also went directly against our community. And so helping him see that was important to me, but also understanding why he would vote and, you know, respect somebody who did not respect our community in the same way. And so with my dad, connecting across that difference or loving across difference was a place to work, because my dad accepted me for who I am, you know, because who we are is not negotiable.
In your personal relationship with your father, who didn't reject you for being gay, and your, like, you know, your path took you to finding common ground with him, what message exactly would you have for those, especially the youth, who have the unfortunate situation of being completely rejected by their parents?
Mm-hmm. That's a tough question, because I do recognize my privilege in having my mom and dad accept me for who I am, because as we all know, sitting in this conversation, that is not the case for almost half of LGBTQIA plus folks, especially young adults who are thrown into the streets by their parents and they become homeless. And I really struggle with that privilege in many ways. On the other side of that, I also think that there are people out there in the LGBTQIQ community who are willing and with open arms, ready to accept queer youth. And it's finding that community and knowing that there are folks all across this country who have been down the same journey or a similar journey to yours. And we're here to accept you and to not give up. And I know that growing up can be hard for a variety of reasons, but when you're growing up LGBTQIA plus, it makes it even harder in a world where it seems like everybody hates you for who you are. and you're constantly having to explain yourself to folks of who you are. And I think knowing that there are others of us out there who are ready to accept you with open arms, I hope will help folks keep faith that there is a brighter future beyond. And sometimes, unfortunately, that isn't with your family.
I think that's a very good point.
And I'll just add too, you know, for decades, since the beginning of time, honestly, LGBTQ folks have had to create their own families, and it's chosen family. And sometimes chosen family can be more special than our family we're born into.
Sort of adding on to this, I know after I realized that I was interested in girls, I also had the privilege of having my mother who was accepting of me. My father less so, but he's never around and never really talks to me. So who gives a shit about him? Whatever. But I know definitely for me, it was like finding other people who were like me or at least accepting, which I know not everyone has that option. But even in school, there's bound to likely be at least one other student like you. And finding people in your community, especially when you're young, can be really, really hard. But at the very least, trying to look and see is definitely something you should do. And then for people who are in online spaces, I know one of my friends figured out that they were both trans and bi, and their family was not accepting. And they primarily found community through their friends in school, but also people online. And that was really helpful for them. And on that note, since I know it's really common nowadays for people to go online to find community if they can't find it in their personal life, just as a general warning, not necessarily related to our conversation, be very careful about who you're interacting with, because as a minor, you still have the risk of adults who will try to take advantage of you, whether they're LGBT or not. So do not, like if you're a child and you're trying to find your community online and you have an adult that tries to emphasize your maturity or tries to get you to do or talk about inappropriate things, cut off communication from them. You should not be interacting with them for your health and safety. Okay, PSA over, thank you.
I think that's a valid...
Wait. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but one of our organizers, Melanie, pointed out just now that even adults can be preyed on. So for adult listeners, be aware of that too. I almost forgot to mention that, but that's a really important thing to emphasize as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I would also say when trying to find your community, seek out institutions of higher education near you. You know, in Indiana is a pretty rural state, but we have like 80 something colleges and universities across the state of Indiana. And most of the publics will have an LGBTQIA plus organization that will welcome in folks who are not students at the institution, who are allowed to attend those meetings. And I know, you know, back when I was in college, we had folks who were not college students. Some of them were older from the community who would attend Spectrum meetings because it was the only space at that time where they could be themselves, connect with other queer people. And I think that's important to find those spaces, but sometimes people don't know where to begin. But I often will say, don't overlook colleges and universities. They're such a resource for many things, including queer folks. I will say too, though, there are some private institutions you have to be careful with. So there is a difference between public and private. And if a private institution, and unfortunately the religious affiliated private institutions do not create safe and welcoming spaces for LGBTQI plus folks. So it's important when you're seeking out a college and university as well, where you may want to attend, to really read the fine print of that institution and what their value systems are. There are lots of great private institutions out there, but speaking for myself as a queer person, I find the public institutions to be 100 times more welcoming.
So kind of going back more to the book, but also talking about the idea of small towns, something I wanted to talk about was kind of the idea of change, because I know that my older sister grew up a closeted lesbian at the same high school I went to. And even just within the 6 years between us in high school, it went from extremely unsafe to be out to me having a GSA in the same school. So, what I wanted to ask was growing up, did you ever think that even in small towns like Muncie, there'd be somewhat mainstream acceptance?
I didn't, in all honesty. It's amazing how much we have progressed in the last even decade. To be honest with you, I didn't. When I was in college, and I think I spoke about this or wrote about this a bit in my book, I was dating a guy at the time, not Steve, who I talk about quite a bit in the book, but someone named Andrew. And Andrew was not out to his family at all. And my family had come to accept me. They still worked through their own little struggles, but they were accepting for the most part when I was in college. And Andrew's family did not. And so, therefore, he wasn't comfortable ever talking about our relationship. And in fact, when his parents would come over, we would do what we called defagging our apartment. And those were his words, not mine, to hide pictures of us. We had two separate bedrooms that we did not use most of the time, but when his parents would come by, we had two separate bedrooms. And I don't think that was uncommon. That wasn't unique to the two of us. That's what life in Indiana was like in the early 2000s. And now, 20 years later, look where we are. And so we can't forget where we came from, but we also have to celebrate where we are today. And at the same time, we also have to recognize that it is not a safe space for everyone in the LGBTQI community in Indiana. So while we've come far, I do think that our trans brother and sisters, our non-binary friends and family, they're facing a struggle that I think, and I'm using the term gay here, I think that those of us who identified as gay in the late 90s, early 2000s, the struggles that we were facing at that time for acceptance are some of the similar but different struggles that I think that the trans community and non-binary community is facing. And we have to make sure that we're there to walk alongside them, to make sure that they get to a place of acceptance too. And unfortunately, as we look at history over time, there's always some subset of a community. And if we're looking at the LGBTQIA plus community, there's going to be another subset of that community after the trans and non-binary that will come along as we find acceptance to be who we are. We don't know yet, right? What other letter or acronym we're going to add to our vibrant community, but we have to be there to fight alongside for those folks. And so 20 years ago, to get back to your original question, no, I never imagined where we'd be today. But at the same time, while celebrating where we are, I also have to pause and look at who isn't at that space yet within our community. And 20 years from now, will they be at the place where we are now, and who is coming after that we need to make sure that we're lifting up?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And there's a lot of progress that still needs to be made, but I think that we will get there. I think despite all the reactionary politics nowadays, I think that the upwards climb of history tends to lean progressive. And I think that eventually we will get past this. But until that point, I kind of wanted to talk about that idea of safety and the idea of balancing being true to oneself and one's safety. So there was a part of your book where you described your senior skip day experience and how you ended up getting your nails painted. As the chapter progresses, you talked about how your mom gave you subtle hints to remove the fingernail polish, but you found the courage to flaunt your newly painted nails, even in school the next week. Fast forward to your college, you described an icebreaker exercise where they asked the students if they believed being gay was right to step forward or stand on the wall. And while obviously you can agree that being gay is okay, there was, especially at the time, kind of an unspoken, if you were supporting it, then you were one. But in that case, you started to step forward, but then decided not to. So the question I want to ask are, there are times when we choose to be bold and other times where we have to observe the environment first to make sure that we are safe before we are bold. Can you kind of expound upon those two situations in the book and why it's important to understand when it's necessary to be bold and when it's not? I guess I think especially nowadays, there's a lot of pressure on queer youth to come out of the closet. And because they see so much positive representation, it's like, well, they're getting to do it. Why can't I? I've had to have that conversation with several of my friends who are like, see me and they want to come out of the closet instantly. And I'm like, your parents will kill you. I know you want to come out, but maybe wait until you have an ability to do so. And so I guess I wanted to hear your take on that kind of concept and how do we survive when we can't be bold?
Mm-hmm. That's a valid point, and I think safety is key. Because I'm a storyteller, I'm going to share another little story or an experience that I had that dates back to, I think, in 2017, 2018. I was invited to give a talk at a university in Connecticut. And often during my talks, I share my coming out story because it's all connected to my message, right? And I had a student who came up to me afterward, and he was from Uganda. He was an international student. And I could tell that he had something he wanted to say, and his eyes were searching, and he was kind of talking around in circles a bit. And then he started to cry, and he said, I'm gay, but nobody knows, and I'm afraid what will happen to me if I come out. And then he went on to tell me about the laws in Uganda and how he would either be put to death or be sent to prison for being who he is. He knows that his family would disown him. And in that instance, that is not a safe place to come out. He felt comfortable to tell me, and it was my responsibility to keep his identity safe, not share his name, all of that, and to hold his story close. And at the same time, my advice to him was, you're in college now. Sometimes it's best to wait to the place where you are financially on your own, where at the moment that you talk to your mom and dad about this and you know that they may not accept you, you can walk away and make a clean break. And that's a hard conversation to have. It's a hard thing to wrestle in your mind about walking away from people who raised you and who love you, or you thought loved you, right? Love is conditional in some instances. And I often find in the LGBTQI community, we find that love is conditional with those who are in our families. And that's not a good place to be. So in my book, when I talk about the nail polish, I was pushing back a bit against my parents. I didn't think that they would disown me, but I wanted to show them that I wasn't willing to conform to what the small town of Callan, Indiana maybe wanted me to be. And then fast forward almost a year or a few months later, and I'm at my orientation for college. I didn't know any of those people. I'd only known them for a day. And having to cross that line would send a clear message to all of the people in that room that I was gay, right? Because as you said before, at least in that time in our history, if you stood up and said, I don't have anything wrong with the LGBTQI community, people would automatically say, oh, well, you must be gay. And that was the mindset. And it might still be the mindset for some individuals. So in that space, when we were doing the cross the line activity, I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like if I crossed that line and showed my authentic, true self to my peers in that room, that the outcome for me would be good. And unfortunately, even now as a 43-year-old person navigating the world, I hate to say it, I try to be my authentic self at all times. But you all know this feeling. This is a feeling that we all have. When you walk into a certain space, you can almost sense immediately whether or not it is a safe place for you. And we have to protect ourselves first and foremost.
I've had to explain to him that, listen, if someone misgenders me in public, do not correct them. I know what I look like. Just let it go for both of our sakes. Or even just things about like when I was asking when he was coming out to his grandparents, I'm like, I don't know, should we do we tell your grandparents kind of, would it be easier for you if I just was a girlfriend for right now? Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I think that that's something we just kind of have to read the room on every time. And I remember I've worked jobs where it's like people will tell me Leo's a weird name for a girl, and I'm like, it sure is. And so I think it's just hard when we kind of have to choose our battles every day.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I think the most important lesson to learn is that you're not lying if you're choosing that battle. There's no shame in holding that back for your own safety or for just waiting a bit until you read the room.
Mm-hmm.
You are under no obligation to tell everyone, or I guess to warn people of your identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, it's interesting when I talk to my cisgender straight friends, they haven't lived the same experiences as us, right? So they don't automatically get it in the same way we do. But I'll often say to them, I'll have to come out of the closet every day the rest of my life until I die, because I meet new people all the time. And eventually, if I want to bring them into my inner circle and I feel like there's a safety there, I have to come out to them because I want them to meet my husband. I want them to see me for who I truly am. But no straight person has ever had to come out to anyone, let alone every single day for the rest of your life. And that's a heavy thing that we have to carry. In some ways, we get used to it and it feels normal. We shouldn't have to normalize that feeling of hiding who we are. But at the same time, as you said, our safety is the most important. And we have to balance that every time we walk into a new situation. And it sucks. And I don't have any words of wisdom to make that any better, other than to say that I wish the world were different. But I also think that, and I am not a religious person, although some people will say to me like, well, you have thoughts like a religious person, what I'm about to tell you. I think that we are all put here for a reason. And the fact that am was born a gay man, I'm here to help change hearts and minds around that. And that's how I view the world. And so when I feel like the space is safe, sharing my story, sharing your story is the most important thing we can do rather than hiding. But if it feels like an unsafe environment, we feel that hair standing up on our arms, protect yourself. Your safety comes first.
This question that I'm about to ask, originally it was a little bit more general, but being here and thinking about it a little bit more, there are definitely going to be, okay, so my question was, as someone who grew up in the middle of a large, like, kind of pushback against gay rights and the gay rights movement, living in a homophobic small town, if you, like, might think that the queer youth of today, like, whether they are not, like, a little bit out of touch with how things used to be compared to today. But as I was saying earlier, there are some people who are growing up in very similar environments or who might be having very similar experiences with family. So to clarify that, I guess maybe in, like, the activist movements, if you maybe see a difference in goals or attitudes about our experiences from youth.
Mm-hmm. I do not think that today's youth are out of touch by any means. I think it's all relative, right? So in my experience, as we had talked about earlier, when I was growing up as a gay man in the 1990s, that was a big deal. It was a big deal to be gay. And our society has progressed a bit since that time. Now it seems like it's a big deal if you say that you're trans or non-binary. People are like, what? I see the similarities to me coming out as a gay man in the 90s to folks who are coming out as trans or non-binary now. Not that our paths are completely the same, but the way people react to that. And I think that young adults today are more likely to embrace themselves than the young adults of my time in the 90s, because we are living in somewhat more of an accepting society. So I would never look at a young adult today and think, wow, you're really out of touch with our history, because it's all relative. The struggle you're going through right now, it's totally different than the struggle I went through in the 90s, although we can say like, oh, they're related in some ways. So I would never discount a current struggle that somebody is going through and say, oh, well, back in my time, right, it was harder. Looking at the activist movements, though, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak for youth. I don't know how much you might know about, the history of LGBTQIA rights versus what, Rose might know or such. So that's a hard question to answer, because I feel like it's so relative and it's so individualized. It depends on the person and their experiences.
Yeah. See, I'm going to be fair. I didn't necessarily write this question, but I know when I think about this question, a lot of times I think about, I guess, see, it's a struggle. As we were talking about earlier, online spaces are becoming much more common, much more utilized by the LGBT community. A lot of times online, it seems like those environments sometimes are a lot more divisive, I would say, and just like, I know in my experiences, you'll have a lot of people who will be trying to sort of comment or give their opinions about certain groups or parts of our history without really knowing the history all the way, and will end up spreading misinformation. I guess it's just like, I also agree. I think that people's experiences are different, and that's something that we shouldn't discount or discredit. But there are some moments where I think queer youth might get a little bit just lost in the sea of information online and then just don't really know what to do with it. But that's sort of a separate issue, I would say. I guess it just speaks to the fact that online, you're supposed to, obviously need to be very careful and critical of what you're consuming, what you're learning, what you're spreading. Mm-hmm. But once again, that's not necessarily like super related to the topic at hand. That's just usually what I think of because I see it a lot.
Yeah, I think also relationships across generational divides are really important to get to your question, because online, as you said, misinformation might be spread. But I found now that I'm considered middle-aged, although I often don't consider myself middle-aged, and then sometimes I have to think like, oh yeah, I am totally middle-aged now. Like, when did that happen? But, when I was younger, I didn't necessarily have older friends in the LGBTQIA plus community. Now that I have reached middle age, I have friends who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And what they experienced, that history, was history that didn't happen when I was alive. And they experienced it in real time. And so creating those friendships across generational divides, I think, is really critical, especially for the LGBTQIA plus community, for us to know where those who came before us, the struggles that they faced. And so many of them have rich stories of how they were a part of that struggle and how they contributed to where we are today. And so sometimes I think moving the conversations from offline is really important, just to have face-to-face conversations about life and finding the human condition that exists between all of us.
I definitely agree with that. I've found my interactions with the other people in my community to be much more engaging and a much better learning experience than experiences online. Though it does have merit. I know as a lesbian, I learned a lot about lesbian history and a bit about history of the bi community as well, because I find that there's a lot of misconceptions that people have that get spread online sometimes. Mm-hmm. But the online information that you can find can definitely be useful, but if you can find in-person LGBT friends to get to know and converse with, definitely go for it, if it's safe for you, of course, because I've just found it to be so constructive. I'm saying that to the listeners. I don't know if I necessarily needed to clarify that, but
sorry. You mentioned that when you came back from your trip, you started to look at CNN in the same way you looked at Fox. You kind of became irritated with both channels. What are some other ways you think you might have changed, or what are some things you view differently now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still watch CNN though, just not as much. It was always a backdrop in my house, no matter
Yeah.
what I was doing, CNN was playing on the TV. And so I've just tried to get away from the constant news cycles happening all the time and just putting down my phone, turning off the TV and focusing my energy elsewhere is a big change that's happened in me since the trip I took with my father. And also this concept of loving across difference, that loving doesn't seem radical on the surface, but love is really a radical concept if you think about it, because you're putting your trust in someone else and they're putting their trust in you. And it has to be a two-way street. Love is when it's a two-way street, right? Understanding isn't always a two-way street. So I've shifted my mind toward loving more than understanding, because I think through loving, you get to the understanding. And that's been a shift in perspective for me on how I just view life. And I try to be open to mistakes and know that we all come with our own humanly flaws and that we all are going to make mistakes at certain times. And prior to the trip with my dad, I just always put people into boxes, right? If you're a part of the LGBTQIA plus community, you think the certain way. If you voted for Trump, you think the certain way. And then what really blew my mind is like, wait, there are LGBTQI people who voted for Trump? Like, how is that even possible? Right. So that was kind of that mix of that nuance that was starting of like, how is this even possible? And so for me, I had to shift my perspective to loving and understanding how to provide space for mistakes if those mistakes aren't going to hurt me, but they're mistakes that we can talk across, right? And that can only happen when love is the answer, and it's both ways. It's coming both ways. And that's a change that's happened in me in the trip. So it's putting my phone down. It's finding that space and quality time with myself and with loved ones.
Though, of course, some mistakes that people make are not necessarily ones that they can come back from. Making mistakes is an essential part of learning and growing as a person. So whether you allow that space in your life for someone to do that with you, or whether they just do it on their own, if they're using that mistake as an opportunity to grow from it, then that's gonna mean the world in some cases for that person and for the people in their life. So that's definitely really, really important.
And you're going to love
On,
them even more for that, right? If they're
mhm.
growing from it, your love for them is going to grow too. And that's how relationships work.
Mm-hmm. On a separate note, in the epilogue of your book, you mentioned that as of 2020, your father no longer supports Trump. So then, if you know specifically, or maybe generally, what was the tipping point for your father? And do you feel that your guys' trip together had any effect on his change?
Yes, the pandemic actually is what changed him the most and woke him up to this idea of, wow, this is getting out of control. And my dad was pro-vaccine from day one. He's fully vaxxed, fully boosted. And the way that the pandemic was handled by the former administration, he just could not get beyond the number of people who had died and how it just wasn't being taken seriously. So that was a switch that went off for him. And from that, we were able to have even deeper conversations about misinformation. And my dad was like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, Trump is very pompous. He is spreading misinformation. So for him, it was just the pandemic is really what set it off. But the fact that we went on the trip together and we had mended our relationship and had become even closer, I think fed into that, but also got us through it, right, to this other side where we are today. Had we not done the trip, I don't know what would have been the outcome. Would my dad still have looked at how the pandemic was handled early on and been like, this is bad? Or would he have been like, oh, it's fine. This is all fake. I don't know. It's, so many things happen in our lives and we intersect with so many people. It's hard to really identify that one experience actually was the thing that changed us. But I think it's a multitude of things that came together at once to create that change. And the trip for us was one of those, I do believe.
I understand. And I remember reading in your book, you mentioned that you would still obviously love your father even if he still supported Trump. And
Mhm.
I'll admit that's honestly where I struggled the most in terms of not just like individual people in my life, but the the right in general is just I empathize or can empathize with 2016 era Trump supporters. I think one of the things you mentioned a lot in your book was that they weren't talking about the racism and the sexism, etc., supportingly. What they were focused on were jobs. A lot of the moderate Trump supporters were worried about jobs. And as someone who I have loved ones who are from Anderson, Indiana,
Mhm.
which is one of those kind of towns that has just been ravaged by the loss of factories. It's an example of like my stepdad grew up there and he'll take me to places and it is a shadow of what it used to be. So
Mhm.
I can really empathize with that the Trump support that comes from poverty and ignorance and
Mhm.
just a grief for the loss of kind of an American dream that doesn't exist anymore. Those factories won't come back. He never intended to make them come back. It was always a grift.
Mhm.
But it's harder for me to empathize now like with the level of almost malignant ignorance and like I don't know how to keep those lines of communication open or I can't discuss politics with someone who doesn't care about facts or basic empathy.
Mhm.
And I guess I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions on trying to talk with that once someone is that deep into it?
Run as fast as you can away from those people is my advice. Like I said in the beginning of our conversation, I knew that my dad was not far gone. He was not somebody who had gone off the deep end like my friend who I spent so much time with in China, who I viewed as somebody who had gone off the deep end. And I was wrestling with, what do we do with this? And my solution was work with my dad, work through my dad, because working through the friend I lived with in China, I didn't feel as safe for me or feel like it was a good use of my time. But working through my dad is. And so I think you're absolutely right. We have reached a place that's far beyond where we were in 2016. And we've reached a place where I look at our society and I'm scared. I'm actually frightened by the amount of misinformation, the way that we treat each other. Um, I, I just, it blows my mind every day when I see it. It's almost like a cult, and I hate to use that word, but in some ways it is, and people have been brainwashed and it's hard to come back from that. And so the only advice I would give is run away from the people who have been totally brainwashed and focus your energy on the people who have the ability to become brainwashed but aren't yet. And what role do we play in making sure that they don't get there? And that's the safest place to use our energy. It's the most efficient place to use our energy. And that's where I would put my efforts.
I think you've partially answered this question already throughout the conversation, but something that I've noticed a lot, and it happened with my own grandfather in terms of I think there's a bit of a rabbit hole or that confirmation bias that happens when there's especially older people who are sitting alone at home all day and just kind of watch Fox News isolated. Is there any way to kind of break that cycle or to I guess, intervene before it gets to the point of, wow, I just need to leave because I can't do this? And how do we, well, they're partially there, how do we keep talking about it? Because, like, in the case of my grandfather, it's like every single conversation was about Benghazi. It doesn't matter if we were discussing the drapes, it would be about Benghazi within like 20 minutes. And so, how do you just not grow tired of that?
It's challenging for sure. There are still moments where I grow really tired of the conversations. One is if you can get them to turn off the TV, do it. So, when I go and visit with my dad, he turns off the TV usually now, and we just sit and we have a talk, or we eat dinner together and, we share a meal. And so there's small steps toward those deeper conversations that have to happen first, and knowing it can't happen overnight. I've gotten to a place with my dad where if we disagree on a topic, I feel safe to say, well, this is why I feel this way about it. And I always speak from my perspective and how it impacts me as a person. And then he'll start to do the same. And sometimes that will open my eyes to see from a different perspective, okay, this is why he feels this way. But then sometimes as he's talking, or maybe as I'm talking too, right, I begin to see, okay, I'm not totally right on this issue, or there is a gray area here that we can talk through. But we've spent now 4, 5, 6 years getting to where we are. And so it doesn't happen overnight. It's an investment of time. And you have to determine if it's a relationship that you're willing to save. And if it's with somebody like a grandfather or grandpa, you may find that it is. I think a starting point is getting him to turn off the TV. And if he gets to a place of just bringing up Benghazi again, what I would do with my own father in a case like that, I'm like, I can see that that's a really important topic for you, but do you mind if we talk about X, Y, and Z instead? Because I really want to focus on what we're getting mom for her birthday. You know what I mean? And so switching their mindset and their conversation back to the personal, I find to be really helpful.
Before we go, one thing you mentioned was there was a feeling of anger from both sides. Sometimes feels like political discourse will pit the big cities and the upper class, like educated left, against basically everyone from the Midwest and the South. Mm-hmm. So kind of like a class sort of warfare. And I've heard people completely write off people from there as nothing but backwards thinking hicks. Have you ever felt snubbed or disliked in more liberal, like city, like urban type circles because of your background? Either every like all the time, you would say?
Every day. I feel like I run into these, maybe not every day, but it comes up. I mean, they're like microaggressions in some way.
Yeah.
I'll give a couple of examples. In one of my old positions, I worked for an organization that was across the country. And I'd interact with people who had the exact same title as me, the same education and training. But some of the folks from the coast, right, the left coast, right coast, they would say things to me like, wow, you're not what I thought people from Indiana would be like. Or
yeah, I feel like the same thing happens to me, where it's like I'm a black trans woman, or I'm this like black queer person, and so they'll be like, oh, like Hunter, it's just hard to believe that you're from Indiana, because like when I think about Indiana, I just think about like a bunch of like white guys in cowboy boots. I'm like, there are other people here, it's not just a certain type of like even amongst the white men in Indiana, there's not just one type of white guy that lives in Indiana. Like there's all different types of aesthetics in Indiana.
Oh yeah, and that happens a lot. Like I know Kentucky, a lot of people will view Kentucky as like, oh, people there are all just like hillbillies and all racist. And it's like, I'm pretty sure it's, is it Lexington? There's like a major city there that's like very LGBT friendly, if not one of the most LGBT friendly cities in America. And there's a lot of progressive stuff going on there. But like, if people don't bother to try to look past that original bias and judgment, they're like not going to know that. And also, it's so annoying.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I feel like there is like that like sort of like hick sort of stereotype, but like I don't know. I found interestingly enough, like because it is Indiana, like there are a lot of guys that have that sort of aesthetic, but like they don't necessarily have like what are the stereotypical views. Cause like just like this is just like a little like small little like bar story or whatever. But I remember I was sitting next to a guy who had like these big like cowboy boots on, and he had like the hoodie on, and like he had the like whole like if you looked at this guy from far, like you would think like, oh yeah, like he's a Trump supporter, he's probably super conservative, like blah 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 blah. So I'm sitting next to him. I'm a black trans woman, and like I don't pass fully. So like you know, a lot of times I'm read as trans. So I'm thinking like, oh yeah, he's probably going to harass me. No, this guy turns towards me, and he starts talking about aliens for the next like 45 minutes. So I don't know. Sometimes people will really surprise you. I don't know.
Yeah, I would totally agree. In fact, some of the most accepting people I met have been in rural communities, believe it or not. I also find within our own state, we make assumptions about each other. So my colleagues down in Indianapolis will often make fun of me for living in Muncie. You know, they'll make comments about, oh, Muncie's so backward, or there's nothing there, or, you know, all these things that it's also, you know, it depends on in our own state where we live. And I also find that people tend to look one state below and make assumptions. So like in Indiana, we look down on Kentucky, but Michigan looks down on us. I don't know if people know that, but people in Michigan think people in Indiana are just the most backwoods, hillbilly.
Like
and so
down on us at this point because of my pants.
yeah. But it does happen all the time. I mean, not just, you know, people out of state. It happens within our own state. But I run into those little microaggressions all the time when people learn that you're from Indiana. You know, it's almost like they can't believe I'm even on a Zoom meeting, right? Like, oh, wow, you guys have internet in Indiana? Yeah, we do.
I feel like...
Okay, maybe it's stupid, but I'm pretty sure the town I was trying to refer to was Louisville or Louisville. People say it differently, but I think that's the right one. So if there are any people listening from Kentucky, sorry if I fucked that up.
I feel like when you're Black, there's like a certain class, like I guess assumed class. So I feel like being a Black queer person in certain queer spaces, it's like because of my Blackness, I'm like interpreted as being like backwards or like being of a lower class. So like I'm interpreted as like not being as queer. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but like because like people assume that people of a certain class are not like with the times or like they are not as progressive, like because I'm a Black person, like people interpret that as like being not as queer. I hope that makes sense. But it's definitely a phenomenon I've noticed because I feel like amongst like classes, like Black people have a certain like assumed class unless we prove that class to be like not accurately how like an already assumed like class because of the way they look.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a deeper problem that we have in the LGBTQIA community, and that's for so long it was built on white identity. And I even saw in Spectrum 20 years ago, I mean, it was mostly all white students and some white folks from the community. And whenever we would have Black or brown folks come in, there was almost like this tension of, you know, like, wait, there are Black gay people, you know, and it was, and I think that tension still exists today that some people are acknowledging and some don't, but I think that goes back to that historical whiteness in the LGBTQI community. And we don't always own or accept not only the class piece that you're talking about, but the discrimination that exists within our own community.
Yeah. And I like, because people have come to me and have asked me like, oh yeah, like why is the Black community so homophobic? And it's like I'm sitting here like as a a Black like femme queer person who has experienced homophobia from like all races. But it's like white people will come to me as a Black queer person and just be like, well, why are Black people so homophobic? It's like, why is the world so homophobic? Like, why don't you go say that to the people that are living in India or people that have to live in like on the continent of Asia who are like being oppressed for being queer and like in prison for being queer, while you're asking me about why Black people are so homophobic. Like,
yeah. Yeah, I always find that so interesting because in my experience, Black women have been some of the most accepting of me in the LGBTQI community.
It's an interesting conversation, especially when we think about how like certain indigenous and like African like cultures were so queer friendly and were so, then they were colonized, and now
like the white people, yes,
like post colonization, yeah, they're anti-queer. Like, and like when like especially when like the Europeans were going to like Africa and stuff like that, like they were encouraging that kind of like homophobic backwards culture. Like they saw the Africans having an interaction with queer culture and like indigenous people having like a third gender, and they saw that as backwards, and like homophobia and transphobia and that like the new way, like that's how you were supposed to live. So it's like when white people come to me and ask me why Black people are so homophobic, it's like, do you not like remember history? Do you not know what colonization is? Like it's not that simple. Like I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot more complicated.
Definitely, not only that, I think another thing that a lot of times throughout our podcast we talk about oppression and how within our society it's intersectional. And I feel like that speaks to a bigger problem of the people in power pitting those who are oppressed against each other. It's, there's like a lot of different reasons, colonization definitely being a big impact on homophobia and transphobia within the Black community.
And I think beyond race and class, it's a religion issue. And we can't forget that. So part of the colonization was also religion, right? And if people, bring up now like, well, the Black community is really homophobic, or look at African countries and they're killing gay people. But as you said, that was not the case before the white settlers came in and imposed their religion on this community.
Think people are ignoring the factor of like the desire to assimilate. And like assimilation has a lot to do with fitting into a certain kind of ideals. And like when we're talking about assimilation, unfortunately, that does not mean like fitting into progressive ideal. It means fitting into ideals that from a larger framework are pretty much white supremacist sort of ideal. So like white picket fence, nuclear family. Not to say that nuclear families are bad or anything like that. I don't want people to listen to this episode and think I'm saying that. But like this idea that is the only way and that's the correct way, like that is a very like white perspective. So yes, if you as a Black person, if you are trying to catch up with white people who have had this culture for so long, it's gonna make you pretty homophobic because you're gonna be looking at what white people have had for so long and you're gonna want to have that. And then you're gonna look at Black queer people and you're gonna be like, well, like, don't you want to catch up with white people? Like, why do you want to have this thing that fits outside of, like, so don't you want to assimilate? Like, that's what our ancestors wanted to do. They wanted to assimilate. It's like they want to assimilate so bad that they ignore like the negative parts of assimilation, I guess. Not to say that nuclear families are bad, though. I just don't want people to be like, Hunter thinks that families are bad.
No, it's really interesting. It made me think about a good friend of mine is in a polyamorous relationship. And he said to me one time, JR, the fact that you're married to a man is assimilating to what straight culture wants you to be. And I said to him, I'm like, I could see how you say that, but I also totally accept you for being in a polyamorous relationship, and that doesn't feel weird to me. That's who you are and who you love. And So essentially, I was saying to him, like, you can't knock me for being married to my husband and becoming too assimilated to culture. We have to love each other where we are, and what's wrong for being our authentic selves. And for him, if it's in a polyamorous relationship, that's great. I love him 100%. Don't knock me for being married to one man.
Also, in that regard, it's just like you're not even like there's a complete difference between you two choosing to get married because you love each other and you want to have that partnership versus trying to change who you are or act in a specific way to appeal to mainstream society and cultural
Yeah, because
expectations
I
of what you
think
should be. Like those are completely different. You can't equate the two. That's not fair to
because
you,
I
and it
think
doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
because I think with the people that are trying to fit into a certain like, and I'm just gonna say this, my father won't like this, but like even growing up, like people try to push a certain ideal of whatever they thought I was supposed to be as somebody who was born inside of a male body, of like whatever type of masculinity I was supposed to fit into. And that was the only acceptable thing for me. And the reason why they were doing that is because they were so obsessed with assimilating that they wanted me to assimilate too. Like that was their way of loving me. That was like my way of loving me, unfortunately. So it's like that's where the problem for me comes in, not necessarily the idea of like a man and woman getting married and having kids. Like, no, I mean, I'm technically a straight woman. So, but like, it's more so just like when you take those ideals and you project them out in a negative way and then try to like micromanage the people around you, and that is your way of loving other people, that's where the idea of assimilation sort of becomes sort of a problem.
All of this is a really good conversation. And the last thing I wanted to point out before we end this podcast is just one of the things we mentioned was the idea that marginalized groups are pitted against each other. And I think something that's often forgotten is the idea of, I think there can be, there is more in common between a person who lives in a big city in poverty and a person who lives out in the country in poverty than there is between a rich person in a city and a poor person in a city. And I think that often, especially nowadays, the poor people who live in like out in the rural areas are pitted against minorities and people who are on welfare, etc. And I think that maybe that could be a good reaching out point, is this idea of remembering that that is something that we have in common, or that is something that you can empathize with. That, you know what, the actual people who are making the laws and pulling the strings don't have their best interests at heart either. And maybe try to talk with them about that. The idea of the 50s that you want to get back got there because of unions, and maybe talk about things like that. I guess meeting them on their level, because I think that they have been tricked into choosing a culture war over their best interests. And I think that that's a way you can kind of talk to people who might not share your same political views. So I think this would be an okay part for a conclusion. I don't know how I felt about ending on what I said, but does that feel okay? Does anyone else want to say things or make statements?
I don't know if it necessarily needs to be concluded or not, but I do want to say it. Yes, classism is one thing that, it's present everywhere. It's very obviously a big contributor in people's lives to the ways that they experience their oppression, I guess. I don't know if that's really how I wanted to word that, but even though classism is so common within our day-to-day life, it's not necessarily something that's talked about as often, I feel like. And I don't know whether that's intentional or not. But not only is it one thing that definitely is, something a lot more of us have in common that we have to deal with that we might think, But also a lot of times people will use classism as a way, like people were talking about in here, to try and keep power over people who are oppressed. I'm getting so caught up in talking that I'm struggling to breathe. But like, for example, one way that Trump specifically played on poor white individuals during the 2016 election was, as people mentioned here, and as you, I assume, touched on in your book as well, was the idea of bringing jobs back. And a lot of times that played into the racism that Trump was spreading through his platform on like, oh, it's not that you guys just lost your jobs, it's that these other individuals who, you know, talking about people south of the border and immigrants and stuff, those are also people who are suffering from the effects of classism and who are also being basically cheated by their governments and by these businesses that would just do the same to you. But it was really to distract them from that fact, right? So bringing classism up is something to look out for, not only as a way to connect with other people, but also as a way to maybe understand certain ways people are perpetuating harmful ideologies. Just something really important to be aware of because it's very, very common and you see it on both sides of the political spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the truth is, I tell people all the time, no one in Washington, or really even for this matter, nobody in our local government, they won't save us. We can only save ourselves. And so if we're putting all of our stock in what we're hearing from politicians and we're just repeating this, we're not going to get anywhere as a society. But we have to remember that we can only save us. And it's messy. But if we don't attempt to try to find a path forward among ourselves, what's the solution? I don't have an answer to that.
I think that is a very strong note to end on. I want to thank you again for coming and interviewing with us. If you would like to plug any social media or future books coming out, you're welcome to do so now.
Sure, thanks. So if folks want to follow me online, if you're on Twitter or Instagram, you can follow me at JR_Jamison, JAMISON. And my website's jrjamison.com, or my professional work through Facing Project. You can find us at facingproject.com or listen to our NPR show that is available anywhere podcasts are played.
Thank you. I will be sure to check that out. Do you want to explain what the Facing Project is? I don't think we covered it. We mentioned it, but I don't think we covered it previously.
Yeah, the Facing Project is a national nonprofit that's housed here in Muncie, or located here in Muncie. I co-founded it in 2012 with Kelsey Timmerman, and the idea is pretty simple. We work with communities, and that's defined broadly. That could be a college or university, that could be an actual city or town, or it could be a series of nonprofits, but they self-select a topic that they want to quote unquote face. And we work with them on our model of pairing writers and storytellers together to sit down and work together on first-person narratives from the storyteller's perspective that are collected within books. So it's a mosaic of stories around that topic. We bring them to life on stage through community theater, and then we further discuss the stories through our podcast on NPR.
That's really cool.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we've done close to 100 projects in 18 different states, ranging from topics from LGBTQIA+ to hunger to homelessness. And it's a way that we don't necessarily put our flag in the ground and say we agree one way or the other on X, Y, and Z, but rather let the stories do what they do best. And that's tell the lived experiences of people in that specific community.
That makes a lot of sense. And I thank you for explaining that. And thank you for your time, because I know it means a lot to all of us at the podcast that you made time to come out here and speak to us about your book and in general.
Yeah, thank you. It was an honor to be on the show. You all are doing great work, and keep it up. Keep telling stories because they matter.
Thank you. And we will. So that is the end of this podcast. We would like to take this time to thank our listeners for tuning in. It means a lot to all of us. If you want to listen to our other episodes, we are available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, Deezer, and Apple Podcasts. If you want to interact with us on social media, just look up our name on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you need someone to talk to, look up the Trevor Project or Muncie Outreach. The suicide hotline number is 800-273-8255. We all care about you, so please take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next episode.